In the golden age of wooden ships and iron men, one sailor stood above all others, not just for his tactical brilliance but for his sheer audacity. Thomas Cochrane, 10th Earl of Dundonald, wasn't merely a naval commander. He was a force of nature, a man who redefined naval warfare through a combination of reckless courage and brilliant innovation. Born into Scottish nobility in 1775, Cochrane's life would become so extraordinary that fiction pales in comparison. Indeed, he would later inspire some of literature's greatest naval heroes, from Horatio Hornblower to Jack Aubrey of Master and Commander. But unlike those fictional characters, every impossible feat in Cochrane's story actually happened. His naval career began inauspiciously at age 17, joining the Royal Navy not out of patriotic fervor but financial necessity, after his father squandered the family fortune on failed scientific inventions. The young aristocrat found himself thrust into the brutal world of naval warfare during Britain's struggle against revolutionary and Napoleonic France. From the beginning, Cochrane displayed two traits that would define his career: a tactical genius that bordered on the supernatural, and an utter inability to tolerate incompetence or corruption in command. The latter would repeatedly sabotage his advancement. The former would make him a legend. By 25, Cochrane commanded the HMS Speedy, a vessel so small it was mockingly called a coffin brig. With just 14 tiny cannons and 54 men, the Speedy seemed destined for insignificance. But in Cochrane's hands, this diminutive vessel became one of the most feared ships in the Mediterranean. During a 13-month cruise, Cochrane captured or destroyed over 50 enemy vessels with his tiny command. The Spanish placed bounties on his head and dispatched special squadrons with the sole purpose of hunting down this Scottish terror. They called him El Diablo, the Devil, and the nickname stuck. But the most astonishing chapter in the Speedy's history came on May 6, 1801, near Barcelona. Cochrane's tiny vessel encountered the Spanish frigate El Gamo, a warship over 4 times its size, with 32 heavy guns and 319 crewmen. By all rational calculation, Cochrane should have fled. Instead, he attacked. Flying American colors to cause confusion, Cochrane maneuvered the Speedy directly alongside the massive Spanish ship, so close that the El Gamo's guns couldn't be depressed enough to hit the smaller vessel. As Spanish cannonballs whistled harmlessly overhead, Cochrane ordered his men to paint the Speedy's sides with red stripes, creating the illusion of devastating battle damage. When the Spanish captain finally realized he'd been tricked, he ordered his crew to board the smaller British vessel. This was exactly what Cochrane wanted. As Spanish sailors prepared to leap aboard, Cochrane suddenly pulled away, firing a devastating broadside into the mass of boarding parties. Then, in a move of breathtaking audacity, Cochrane ordered his own boarding party, just his crew of 54, against over 300 Spaniards. But he employed a brilliant psychological ploy. While the majority of his small crew stormed aboard, Cochrane kept a few men behind, instructing them to maintain a constant drumbeat as if reinforcements were coming. The Spanish, already rattled by Cochrane's unorthodox tactics, believed they were being overwhelmed by waves of British boarders. In less than 10 minutes, the massive El Gamo struck its colors in surrender. The Spanish captain died in the action, reportedly of shame at being defeated by such a diminutive opponent. When news of the victory reached London, many refused to believe it until official confirmation arrived. This stunning victory epitomized Cochrane's approach to warfare: creative thinking, psychological manipulation, and audacious risk-taking that confounded enemies who operated by conventional rules. The Spanish had followed naval orthodoxy. Cochrane had rewritten it. Yet this triumph was just the opening salvo in what would become one of history's most extraordinary naval careers. A career that would take Cochrane from the heights of British adoration to the depths of disgrace, and eventually across the world's oceans as he revolutionized the navies of multiple nations. For Thomas Cochrane, the impossible was merely a challenge not yet overcome, and his greatest challenges and triumphs still lay ahead. Despite Cochrane's tactical brilliance, his career in the Royal Navy was perpetually undermined by his own rebellious nature. He despised corruption and incompetence, expressing his opinions with a bluntness that made powerful enemies. As his combat victories accumulated, so too did his conflicts with naval authorities. In 1706, Cochrane was given command of the frigate HMS Pallas and immediately resumed his reign of terror against French shipping. During one particularly bold raid, he sailed directly into the mouth of the Garonne River in France, capturing numerous vessels under the very noses of their coastal batteries. When a French squadron was dispatched to capture him, Cochrane not only escaped, but managed to seize another prize ship during his retreat. His crowning achievement in the Pallas came when he captured a Spanish galleon carrying gold bullion worth over $100 million in today's currency. The prize money made Cochrane temporarily wealthy, but more importantly, it elevated his public profile in Britain. Cochrane was becoming not just a naval hero, but a celebrity. This fame led to an unexpected detour: politics. Leveraging his popularity, Cochrane won election to Parliament in 1806. His constituents hoped he would champion naval reform. They weren't disappointed. Cochrane launched scathing attacks on corruption in naval administration, particularly the prize money system that enriched admirals at the expense of common sailors. His parliamentary speeches were as fearless as his naval attacks, but they earned him dangerous enemies in both the Admiralty and government. Naval authorities, seeking to silence their most vocal critic, assigned him to increasingly marginal commands despite his proven combat record. Yet Cochrane's genius couldn't be suppressed for long. In 1808, he was given command of HMS Imperieuse and sent to harass the French coast. What followed was a one-man reign of terror along French shores that tied down thousands of Napoleon's troops. Cochrane and his crew would land at nightfall, destroy coastal fortifications, and vanish by dawn. During this period, Cochrane demonstrated another of his defining characteristics: genuine compassion for civilians. Unlike many commanders of the era who treated enemy populations as legitimate targets, Cochrane issued strict orders against harming non-combatants or their property. This humanity, unusual for the brutal warfare of the time, earned him respect even from his enemies. By 1809, Britain's Admiralty could no longer ignore Cochrane's tactical genius. They needed him for a seemingly impossible mission: destroying the French fleet anchored in the heavily fortified harbor of Aix-Roads on France's Atlantic coast. The French ships were protected by a powerful shore battery and had anchored in a position that was considered unassailable. Cochrane proposed a radical solution: fireships. But not just ordinary fireships. He designed what he called explosion vessels, ships packed with gunpowder, combustibles, and hundreds of shells and grenades rigged to detonate in sequence. These floating bombs would create not just fire, but catastrophic explosions to break the French defensive line. The Admiralty approved the plan, but, distrusting Cochrane's independence, placed him under the command of Admiral Lord Gambier, a methodical, risk-averse officer who was also Cochrane's political opponent. On the night of April 11, 1809, under Cochrane's direct supervision, the attack began. He personally commanded the lead explosion vessel, staying aboard until the last possible moment before the floating bomb was set to detonate. As Cochrane and his skeleton crew escaped in a small boat, the explosion ship erupted with such violence that the concussion could be felt miles away. The psychological effect on the French was devastating. In the chaos and darkness, the French cut their anchor cables and ran their ships aground to escape what they thought was a massive British attack force. By dawn, the entire French fleet lay helpless, stranded on shoals as the tide receded. Cochrane signaled furiously to Admiral Gambier to send in the British fleet to destroy the stranded enemy ships. But Gambier, perhaps jealous of the younger officer's initiative, hesitated. For hours he delayed, allowing the French precious time to work some vessels free as the tide returned. Cochrane, incensed by this squandered opportunity, finally took matters into his own hands. With just his single frigate, he attacked the grounded French fleet alone, destroying several vessels before Gambier finally ordered reinforcements. The Battle of Aix Roads should have been Cochrane's greatest triumph. Instead, it became the catalyst for his downfall in the Royal Navy. Cochrane's open criticism of Gambier's hesitation would soon transform naval hero into national outcast. Cochrane's naval career might have continued its meteoric rise had he been able to navigate the political waters as skillfully as he sailed hostile seas. But his integrity proved to be both his greatest strength and his fatal weakness. Following the Battle of Aix Roads, Cochrane publicly criticized Admiral Gambier's failure to capitalize on the opportunity to destroy the entire French fleet. This was tantamount to career suicide in the rigid hierarchy of the Royal Navy. When Gambier demanded a court-martial to clear his name, the Admiralty predictably exonerated him and effectively ended Cochrane's active naval service for Britain. Relegated to the sidelines of the Napoleonic Wars, Cochrane intensified his political activities, becoming an even more vocal critic of corruption and a champion of democratic reforms. This made him a hero to common citizens, but a dangerous radical to the establishment. In 1814, Cochrane's life took a dramatic turn. He became embroiled in what became known as the Great Stock Exchange Fraud. A false report of Napoleon's death triggered a massive rise in government securities prices. When the deception was discovered, investigators found that Cochrane's uncle and financial advisor had made substantial profits from the market fluctuation. Though evidence of Cochrane's personal involvement was circumstantial at best, his political enemies seized the opportunity to destroy him. In a trial riddled with judicial improprieties, Cochrane was convicted of fraud. The punishment was severe: a 1,000-pound fine, a year's imprisonment, public pillory, and dismissal from the Royal Navy. Perhaps most painfully for Cochrane, he was stripped of his knighthood, with his banner as a Knight of the Bath ceremonially kicked down the steps of Westminster Abbey. The pillory sentence, where Cochrane would have been publicly humiliated and possibly killed by angry mobs, was eventually dropped due to fears that his popularity might trigger riots in his defense. But the damage to his reputation and career in Britain seemed irreparable. After serving his prison term, a disgraced and embittered Cochrane looked abroad for opportunities to continue his naval career. He didn't have to wait long. Revolution was sweeping through South America as colonies fought for independence from Spain, and revolutionary leaders were eager to secure the services of the legendary El Diablo. In 1818, Cochrane accepted an offer to become Admiral of Chile's fledgling navy in its war for independence from Spain. Upon arriving in Valparaiso, he found a nascent naval force consisting of just a few converted merchant ships manned by inexperienced crews. Against them stood the powerful Spanish Navy that had dominated Pacific waters for centuries. Undeterred by these odds, Cochrane immediately set about transforming this ragtag collection of vessels into an effective fighting force. His first target was the heavily fortified Spanish port of Valdivia, considered impregnable with its series of forts mounting over 100 guns. True to form, Cochrane devised an audacious plan. With just 3 small ships and 300 men, he would attempt what the Spanish considered impossible. Under cover of darkness on February 20th, 1820, Cochrane's forces landed and, through a series of coordinated attacks, captured each fort in sequence. By morning, the supposedly impregnable Valdivia had fallen with minimal casualties. The psychological impact of this victory was enormous. Throughout Spanish South America, the colonizers' aura of invincibility was shattered. Meanwhile, Cochrane became a hero to independence movements across the continent. But Cochrane's most spectacular achievement in Chile came with his capture of the Spanish frigate Esmeralda. The vessel was anchored in Callao Harbor in Peru, protected by shore batteries, armed gunboats, and floating booms. Cochrane's plan was characteristically bold: a night-cutting-out expedition using small boats. To confuse the Spanish, Cochrane ordered his men to wear white armbands, similar to those worn by Spanish sailors. As they approached Spanish vessels in the darkness, they were initially mistaken for friendly forces. When challenged, Cochrane's perfect Spanish allowed him to briefly deceive the sentries before launching his attack. In hand-to-hand combat, Cochrane personally led the boarding party onto the Esmeralda. Despite being wounded in the thigh, he continued directing the action until the Spanish frigate was captured. In less than 15 minutes, Cochrane's men had seized the most powerful Spanish warship in the Pacific. This victory effectively ended Spanish naval power in the region and was the turning point in Chile's war for independence. Simón Bolívar, the great liberator of South America, declared that Cochrane's capture of the Esmeralda was worth more than 1,000 victories on land. Yet, despite these triumphs, Cochrane's time in Chile would end as many of his postings did, in bitter disputes By 1823, Thomas Cochrane had transformed from disgraced British admiral to South American liberator. His exploits had taken on a nearly mythical quality, attracting the attention of emerging nations worldwide. When Brazil declared independence from Portugal, Emperor Pedro I knew exactly who he needed to command his new navy: the legendary Lord Cochrane. Cochrane arrived in Rio de Janeiro in March 1823 and was immediately appointed First Admiral of the Brazilian Navy. His mission was dauntingly familiar: create a navy from scratch and use it to secure a nation's independence against a superior European power. The Portuguese fleet blockading Brazil was formidable, with more ships, better equipment, and experienced crews. Cochrane, by contrast, had a collection of poorly maintained vessels crewed largely by mercenaries with questionable loyalty. Undaunted, he raised his flag on the frigate Pedro I and sailed to confront the Portuguese blockade of Bahia. What followed was vintage Cochrane. Rather than engaging in conventional battle, he used psychological warfare to devastating effect. During nighttime operations, he would arrange lanterns on small boats to create the illusion of a massive attacking fleet. On other occasions, he would sail directly at Portuguese squadrons with such confidence that they assumed he must have overwhelming forces behind him and retreated without firing a shot. These tactics culminated in a brilliant deception off Bahia. Cochrane, with just one ship, managed to lure the entire Portuguese fleet away from the harbor by creating the impression that he was leading them toward a large Brazilian squadron waiting over the horizon. The Portuguese pursued for days before realizing they had been duped by a single vessel. By the time they returned to Bahia, the city had fallen to Brazilian forces. Following this success, Cochrane pursued the retreating Portuguese fleet all the way to the mouth of the Tagus River in Portugal itself. A journey of over 4,000 miles. This unprecedented naval pursuit effectively ended Portuguese attempts to reassert control over Brazil. For these services, Emperor Pedro granted Cochrane the title of Marquess of Maranhão and substantial estates. However, in what had become a recurring theme, Cochrane soon clashed with Brazilian authorities over prize money and recognition. By 1825, he had resigned his commission and was again seeking new horizons. He didn't have to wait long. Greece was fighting for independence from the Ottoman Empire, and its provisional government desperately needed naval leadership. In 1827, Cochrane accepted the position of Commander-in-Chief of the Greek Navy. The Greek assignment proved to be Cochrane's most challenging. Unlike in South America, where he had at least some ships and trained sailors, the Greek Navy consisted primarily of converted merchant vessels and fireships operated by independent-minded islanders unused to military discipline. Furthermore, factionalism within the Greek independence movement meant that Cochrane often found himself caught between competing political interests. Nevertheless, he persevered, implementing naval blockades and harassing Ottoman shipping. His mere presence boosted Greek morale and concerned the Ottomans, who knew his reputation. Although he achieved less dramatic successes than in his previous commands, Cochrane's contribution to Greek independence was significant enough that he remains honored in Greece to this day. By 1828, having helped 4 nations secure their independence, the 53-year-old Cochrane might have been expected to retire to a life of comfortable obscurity. Instead, his story took another remarkable turn, a return to the country that had once branded him a criminal. In Britain, public opinion had shifted drastically in Cochrane's favor. New evidence suggested he had been wrongfully convicted in the stock exchange fraud case. A growing movement, supported by influential figures including the Duke of Wellington, advocated for his formal rehabilitation. In 1832, King William IV granted Cochrane a free pardon and restored him to the Royal Navy list. The following year, he was reinstated as a Knight of the Bath. By 1847, he had risen to the rank of Rear Admiral and was finally awarded the decorations he had earned during the Napoleonic Wars nearly 4 decades earlier. Cochrane's return to favor coincided with revolutionary changes in naval technology. Always the innovator, he embraced these developments enthusiastically. He advocated for steam-powered warships when many naval officers still considered them unreliable. He developed plans for chemical warfare, armor-plated vessels, and even early versions of torpedoes. Ideas so advanced that many were dismissed as fantastical until they became standard naval technologies decades later. Perhaps his most prescient innovation was his proposal for what he called sustained combustion engines, early jet propulsion concepts that Thomas Cochrane's naval brilliance can be measured not just in battles won, but in how profoundly he transformed maritime warfare. What made him truly exceptional was his unique combination of tactical innovation, psychological warfare, and personal courage. Unlike most commanders of his era who relied on established naval doctrine, Cochrane approached each engagement as a unique puzzle requiring an original solution. When conventional warfare favored the stronger force, Cochrane specialized in unconventional tactics that nullified his opponent's advantages. Consider his consistent use of deception. Off the coast of Chile, he once flew American colors to approach Spanish vessels, then rapidly switched to British colors just before firing, technically maintaining the naval rule against firing under false flags while still gaining a tactical advantage. In Brazil, he frequently sailed small boats with lanterns at night, creating phantom fleets that paralyzed Portuguese commanders with indecision. Equally remarkable was Cochrane's mastery of psychological warfare. He understood that defeating an enemy's mind often preceded defeating their forces. Before attacking the Spanish fortress at Valdivia, he captured a small outer fort and had his men don the uniforms of the captured Spanish soldiers. As they approached the main fortress, the defenders initially mistook them for retreating comrades, allowing Cochrane's forces to get dangerously close before launching their attack. Perhaps most impressive was Cochrane's ability to inspire unwavering loyalty in his crews, despite the extreme risks of his operations. This stemmed from several factors: his willingness to lead from the front, his fair treatment of sailors, unusual for the era, and his consistent success against overwhelming odds. Sailors who served under Cochrane knew they might face extraordinary dangers, but they also knew they stood an excellent chance of victory and prize money, under his command. Cochrane's innovations extended beyond tactics to technology. Throughout his career, he championed and sometimes invented new weapons and systems. His explosion ships used at Aix Roads were not simple fire ships, but sophisticated weapons designed to create precisely timed detonations. Later in life, he developed plans for steam-powered warships when most naval officers still considered sails superior, and he advocated for the use of armor plating decades before ironclad vessels became standard. His personal papers reveal designs for weapons so advanced they couldn't be produced with the technology of his time, including an early concept for torpedoes and chemical weapons, though he argued these would actually be more humane than conventional warfare by ending conflicts more quickly. Many of these innovations would eventually become reality, though rarely with credit to their original conceiver. The cumulative effect of Cochrane's career was to democratize naval warfare. Before him, naval victory typically went to the nation with the most ships and heaviest guns. After him, ingenuity, daring, and psychological warfare became recognized as equally important factors. This transformation benefited emerging nations particularly, allowing newly independent countries like Chile and Brazil to defend themselves against established European powers with much larger navies. Beyond his military achievements, Cochrane's life reveals a complex and sometimes contradictory character. He was simultaneously a nobleman and a radical, a disciplinarian and a rebel against authority, a tactical genius and a political knife. He fought with spectacular success for 4 different nations, yet frequently fell out with the governments he served. These contradictions extend to his personal relationships as well. His marriage to Catherine Barnes, a beautiful commoner 20 years his junior, whom he married against his family's wishes, was remarkably devoted and enduring. Catherine accompanied him on many of his international adventures, enduring hardships and separation that would have broken many relationships of the era. Their correspondence reveals a deep and abiding connection that contrasts sharply with Cochrane's combative professional relationships. Cochrane's ethical stances were similarly complex. He railed against corruption, yet was repeatedly embroiled in disputes over prize money. He showed remarkable humanitarian concern for civilian populations, but developed weapons of unprecedented destructive potential. He championed democratic reforms in Parliament but accepted aristocratic titles from foreign monarchs. These contradictions have made Cochrane a challenging figure for historians to categorize. Was he a selfless liberator or a mercenary? A visionary or an opportunist? A wronged hero or a man who created his own troubles? The evidence suggests he was all of these things at different times. A man of extraordinary capabilities whose flaws were as outsized as his talents. The legacy of Thomas Cochrane extends far beyond his own remarkable lifetime. His influence can be traced through 3 distinct channels: military innovation, political transformation, and cultural impact. Militarily, Cochrane's tactics became case studies in naval academies worldwide. His emphasis on surprise, deception, and psychological warfare influenced generations of naval commanders. During the American Civil War, Confederate raiders explicitly studied Cochrane's methods of commerce disruption. In both World Wars, his concepts of special operations and unconventional warfare found new applications. Even today, Naval Special Forces operations often reflect principles Cochrane pioneered 2 centuries ago. Politically, Cochrane stands as a pivotal figure in the independence movements that reshaped the Western Hemisphere. Simón Bolívar, the great liberator of South America, acknowledged that Cochrane's naval campaigns were essential to breaking Spanish colonial power. In Brazil, Cochrane is officially honored as a national hero who secured the world's 5th largest nation's independence. few individuals can claim to have played such a decisive role in the formation of multiple modern nations. Culturally, Cochrane's influence has been equally profound through the fictional characters he inspired. C.S. Forester openly acknowledged that Horatio Hornblower was based largely on Cochrane. Patrick O'Brien's Jack Aubrey, brought to life by Russell Crowe in Master and Commander, similarly draws heavily from Cochrane's exploits. Through these fictional avatars, Cochrane's approach to leadership and warfare has reached millions who might never have encountered his historical name. What makes Cochrane's story particularly resonant is its arc of redemption. His fall from grace in Britain, from a celebrated hero to convicted fraudster, would have ended most careers. Yet Cochrane not only rebuilt his reputation but achieved even greater fame through his international exploits. His eventual rehabilitation in Britain, complete with restored honors and a hero's burial in Westminster Abbey, represents one of history's great personal vindications. Thomas Cochrane embodied contradictions that make him distinctly modern. A nobleman who fought for democratic reforms, a military commander with humanitarian concerns, an establishment figure who repeatedly challenged authority. These complexities have allowed each generation to find in Cochrane a reflection of their own values and concerns. Perhaps most remarkably, many of the innovations Cochrane proposed were so far ahead of their time that they seemed like fantasy to his contemporaries. His designs for steam-powered warships, chemical weapons, and armored vessels would all eventually become reality, though rarely with acknowledgement of their original conceiver. In this respect, Cochrane was not just a naval commander, but a visionary who glimpsed warfare's future. As we reflect on this extraordinary life, spanning from the American Revolution to the eve of the American Civil War, we're reminded of history's contingent nature, the independence of multiple nations, the development of naval warfare, and even the creation of beloved fictional characters, all pivoted on the actions of this single remarkable individual. Thomas Cochrane, nobleman and revolutionary, hero and outcast, tactical genius and political liability, remains one of history's most fascinating contradictions. A man who changed the world while remaining, even now, strangely uncelebrated outside naval circles. His story reminds us that history's most influential figures aren't always its most famous, and that true innovation often comes from those willing to defy convention at great personal risk. In an age of sail and shot, one man's courage and creativity reshaped nations. That, perhaps, is Thomas Cochrane's most enduring legacy.